And hello and welcome to World Oregon's webinar today on May 24th, World Fairs and Expos, Refocusing the Lens, Past and Present. We're excited to be presenting this program in partnership with a lot of partners I'll mention here soon. First, just a few words about World Oregon and our events, and before we get into today's program. First of all, thanks so much for joining us. For those who have been on a World Oregon program before, you know these webinars have video and audio only for the presenters and World Oregon staff. And we ask that audience members post questions in the Q&A. We will post links in the chat of interest to the audience. You will not have your video or your audio on in the audience during the event. This is a free program, support by World Oregon members and also by our partners that I'll mention here in just a minute. Wanted to first talk about some of the upcoming events we have in the next week or two. We have our International Speaker Series, which many of you joined in previous ones. We have Fiona Hill talking about Russia this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Pacific. Should be a great discussion. And Lindsay Adario, the photojournalist, talking about her experience from the front lines in various conflict situations on June 7th. We'll post the link for that. We also have Michael Mandelbaum and June 9th talking about the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, his new book. We're really excited about all those programs. We're posting links in the chat for how to register for these events or buy tickets. Again, today's event will be recorded for posting on YouTube and for sharing with the Global Ties US network. We're thrilled to be partnering with Global Ties and other partners for this event. In fact, this program is made possible in part through the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the U.S. Department of State's Bureau for Education and Cultural Affairs, and Global Ties US, of which World Oregon is a member. It's being promoted with our local partners, Oregon Historical Society. And I'm going to post also in the chat links where you can find full bios of our presenters. You'll hear me mention our presenters and also the oral history that is being referenced about World Expos. I'm going to just do brief bio introductions because they're 3 amazing presenters and I don't want to take up too much time with bios, but so go to the website for the full story. But I'll mention them in the order that they're going to be presenting here today. The first is Lisa Blee, who's an associate professor of history at Wake Forest University and teaches courses American West, Native American history, environmental thought, many other areas. And she has previously written and given talks about the 1905 Lewis and Clark Exposition for the Oregon Historical Quarterly, a publication of our partners, Oregon Historical Society, as well as the Portland Art Museum. Our second speaker is Anna Kaplan, who's a PhD, an oral historian, and interested in how memory and how individuals and communities remember the past and tell stories to shape the future. She's done a lot of work and a great deal of projects working with the Smithsonian and a number of universities. We're thrilled to have her join. And then last is Cara Sanesco, is the senior coordinator in the International Expositions Unit at the U.S. Department of State and was the project manager for the Usa Pavilion at Expo 2020 in Dubai. And she's going to talk about that and what's the present and the future in expositions. So it should be an engaging presentation. We'll have questions moderated by my colleague, Director of Programs, Tim DeRoche, later in the program. Again, we have posted links in the chat to the oral history and also bios of our presenters. All 3 have slides and they will be sharing screens, so you'll be able to enjoy their presentations. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Lisa to start us.
All right, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen now. There we are. All right, so my job as the historian is to bring some context to the conversation and some background. So international expositions or World's Fairs started in their modern form with London's Crystal Palace in 1851, pictured here. The Great Exhibition, as it was known, introduced Britain as the world's industrial and cultural leader by collecting and amassing and displaying art, technology, and colonial raw materials for the purpose of impressing visitors. So expositions are a collection of symbols that tell stories to the visitors that come. And for over 150 years, visitors flock to World's Fairs to see new inventions, grand architecture, and to learn about other people and other places. And the symbols that they encountered reinforce a sense of confidence that technological innovation and national unity can and hopefully will bring about human progress and world peace. But fairs emerged and grew out of a time marked by the development of ethnic nationalism and imperialism as well, and thus carry with them a more complicated story and legacy that I'd like to share with you. So I want to focus down on the period in which Portland hosted a World's Fair in 1905, and to contextualize some of its features in American history and culture. Between 1876 and 1916, just this 40-year period, American fairs made up about a third of all international expositions, and they attracted 100 million visitors. Fairs in this period celebrated American industrial achievements and introduced the US as a competitor technologically, culturally, artistically to the great nations of Europe. So just like those European fairs, American fairs endeavored to showcase and to celebrate progress. But the US faced some unique issues from Europe at this point. With fresh scars from the Civil War, the nation struggled to unify amidst really significant social cleavages, right, between the North and the South, Black and white, labor and capital, immigrant and so-called native-born men and women. So the question of this period was, who is an American, right? Who's in and who's out? Politically, this question was answered with policies such as the forced assimilation of Native people and with Jim Crow. It was answered with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the U.S. extended political control over territories in which the residents of those territories would be conquered subjects rather than U.S. citizens. So the question of who and what is American was answered culturally with fair exhibits, architecture, and programs in this period. The fair's main buildings, kind of at the heart of the World's Fairs, were consistently classical European in design. And this suggested to visitors that America was kind of carrying the mantle of empire westward across the globe. And if the architecture wasn't kind of obvious enough, this message was made explicit in the Portland kind of entrance gate, where you can see the phrase emblazoned above, "Westward, the course of empire takes its way." And every fair focused on industrial and technological innovation to showcase the nation's role in advancing civilization. Yet this faith in progress, which is so fundamental to World's Fairs, was inseparable from a version of social Darwinism that held that races progress along defined stages of development, starting with primitiveness and ending with civilization. And then, as you can see, white Americans were at the top. American fairs sought to confirm this narrative of white supremacy by presenting and demonstrating it as a historical and scientific fact through all kinds of symbols. So we can see this narrative as early as the 1876 Centennial Exhibition, when the Smithsonian brought native items, some of which were actually plundered from burial sites, for display in the government building, like so many trophies. And at the 1893 Columbian Exposition, Wild West reenactments reinforced kind of savage narrative or savage warrior stereotype. And then there were staged photos of Geronimo that were then commercialized, that were sold, that sent the message that Indigenous people were exotic curiosities who were actually violently opposed to progress. So US expositions also supported the South's lost cause narrative, and many, including Portland's, featured this attraction called the Old Plantation, complete with happy enslaved people and a vaudeville show with black-faced minstrels. This concession told visitors that slavery was a paternalistic institution that sought to civilize Africans and their descendants on American soil. Meanwhile, exposition organizers asked scholars for help in crafting what they intended as educational exhibits. Anthropologists in this era held to a theory of racial hierarchy based on cranial capacity, that skull sizes and shapes would be linked to intelligence and also character traits. And because these theories emerged from science, or supposedly from science, they were then supposed to be observable. So at the 1904 St. Louis Exposition, an anthropology lab was set up where scholars demonstrated skull measurements before this steady stream of visitors. So these visitors would see the results and they'd come away with a belief in Euro-American superiority based on the most cutting-edge scientific research methods. So altogether, right, these exhibits promoted a story of national unity by sorting out who was a part of the vanguard of civilization and who was outside of it, and either deserved exclusion or assistance, kind of catching up. So the story of American progress, premised on the superiority of white bodies and citizenship, gained a new and more complicated dimension after 1898, when the US moved to exploit the resources of overseas territories. So fair managers, with the help of the federal government, displayed America's acquisitions and showed how US paternalism was going to benefit the world and uplift American colonial wards. So the Portland World's Fair. The concessions were located on a main avenue called the Trail. So here is where visitors encountered food vendors, slot machines, souvenir shops, performing horses, a fortune teller, and live performances intended to kind of introduce them to the world, but also to present others as exotic. There's a Canal of Venice, there's the streets of Cairo, a Japanese tea house. And at these live displays, fairgoers had the chance to consider the narratives of racial hierarchies that they had been schooled in elsewhere in the fairs. And they also had the opportunity to learn about the nation's colonial subjects. So in order to teach about these others, the Portland planners hoped for huge Indian and Philippine exhibits populated with numerous types, as they called them, or tribes. In the end, they settled for contracts with a single Indian reservation and one Philippine tour group. On the Trail, Native people appeared in a concession called the Indian Collection. Here, families of Nez Perce and Umatilla men, women, and children lived in teepees and interacted with visitors. So even though everyday Nez Perce and Umatilla life at this time looked pretty closely resembled that of their non-Indian neighbors, the 25 contracted performers built teepees and wore clothing that emphasized their difference and connection to the past. They were in fact not allowed to wear the modern fashion at the time. Among this group were men who fought against the US in wars 30 years previously, and including a man that the newspapers described as an old veteran who wears his enemy's scalp locks. Such sensational reports, which were commonplace in the newspapers, shaped visitors' expectations of what they saw when they got to the fair. So by linking this group with warfare, which is only one dimension of their lives, of course, the representation reinforced stereotypes while justifying the violent US invasion of native homelands of the recent past. And by pointing out the advanced age and the older style of home, Indigenous people would be considered primitive relics of the past, left behind by the modernity and progress that was celebrated everywhere else at the fair. And ephemera available as souvenirs, such as this postcard, also reinforced these negative stereotypes of Native people and would help to school the fairgoers in kind of prepare them for what they were seeing when they encountered people in the live displays. And the live display of the Filipino group on the Trail, likewise, was supposed to teach about the human stages of progress while justifying US imperialism. The Filipino exhibit was in fact one of the most popular concessions of all American fairs of this period. And fair organizers knew they had to include a Filipino exhibit if they wanted to make a hefty revenue. So the Portland Fair organizers contracted with a concession manager who brought 18 men and 7 women from different 2 or 3 different villages in the Philippines, and they constructed their homes on the fairgrounds. The Igorot village, as it was called, and the group that lived in it was presented as a curiosity. Right, so they're clad in G-strings, they're living without modern conveniences, and they're untutored in Western ways. Like previous fairs, in Portland, the pamphlets and the sensational local press described the group as a race who had not progressed up the path of civilization. So to illustrate this theory, the Igorot performers simply kind of performed everyday tasks, such as eating, caring for children, kind of home maintenance. And because they did these tasks in front of a paying audience, that audience was primed to read these activities as exotic and as primitive. Right. So this exhibit, as the planners hoped, was wildly popular, and it won 3 gold medals. I'm happy to speak more about that in greater detail if there are questions afterward. The Portland's Fair was considered a success by usual measures. It was a turning point in Portland's cultural and economic development, and for a while, until the 1909 fair in Seattle, Portland could actually claim to be the largest city in the Pacific Northwest. This was kind of the point of these regional fairs. But the fair also peddled romantic notions of expansion, promoted a story of racial hierarchy and white supremacy, and objectified colonized human bodies to spur the city's growth. So it also provided evidence for visitors as they considered the nation's history and contributions to the world. America's imperial fairs give us this really interesting glimpse into the ways these events answered the question of what it means to be American and even human in a globalized context in this period. And I will stop there.
That's great. Thank you, Lisa. I believe I am up next. That's great to have this context, because I think a lot of the information that we got from people in the US and people who had been to participated in expos abroad who we interviewed drew on some of this history. And I think there's a lot of connections between those 2 ages of expos and the mid 20th century of expos, as well as, I'm sure, expos today. So I'm going to share my slides, and I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about the work that we did researching and documenting experiences of expos in the 20th and 21st century from the American experience. And so, just as an overview, this was a study that we conducted from September 2021 through January 2022. We interviewed 46 narrators. So I interviewed 30 people who experienced expos that were hosted in the United States. And these were in Seattle in 1962, in New York City in 1964 and 65, and San Antonio in 1968, and then New Orleans in 1984, which was the last expo hosted in the United States. Hopefully not for very long, though. And then my partner, my colleague, Maggie Lemire, interviewed 16 youth ambassadors who represented the US in expos abroad from 2010 to 2017. And these were in Shanghai, Yusuf, Milan, and Astana. And we were interviewing people using an oral history method, which is a long form, in-depth conversation. So our interviews were one-on-one and usually lasted from about an hour to almost 2 hours. And that really gave each person an opportunity to share with us who they were, a little bit of their background, and contextualizing themselves before they spoke about their experiences with the expos, so that we could better understand the approach that they brought to their experiences, or how they understood their experiences. And then we also explored with them how those experiences had an impact on their lives after the expos. So trying to understand some of these felt experiences, these felt memories of the expos, but also what they meant for these full lives. And in addition to that, we also weren't focusing too much on exact facts, but more of the ways in which people experienced things, the way that they had an impact on individuals, rather than getting a lot of facts and figures, but really sort of how people remembered them, how they incorporated these experiences into their lives or not, and trying to understand the ways in which these expos had a legacy on individual people as well as cities as a whole. And so these gave us a glimpse into some of the long-standing sociocultural impacts of these events on US citizens, whether they're hosted in the US or citizens representing the US abroad. So I'm going to give you a few an overview of a few findings before telling you a little bit more in detail what we learned from some of these interviews. So in general, the narrators or the interviewees agreed that they got the most out of US participation that was robust, and thinking about reimagining it to capitalize on the country's greatest soft power assets. And they saw these as its values, its innovations, and its people. So really wanting to have Expos show the US's full diversity, innovations, creativity, explorations, the things that we hold the most dear and that we want to keep promoting as valuable assets to the United States. They also really wanted those person-to-person interactions and being able to explore different cultures, different traditions from around the world, but also from within the United States through Expos, of seeing this as an opportunity to come together and have mutual exchange that goes beyond just looking at a picture or display, but really being to engage and talk to other people. And part of this meant that they wanted Expos to continue to be and to improve the experience of all of those involved, and to make sure that it prioritized inclusiveness and accessibility for people who attend, but also in who's participating, of who gets to represent the US. And I think, as Lisa brought up with past Expos, continuing to ask this question of who does the US say is an American or is part of the US in these displays at the Expos and through participation at the Expos. So a lot of our narrators really wanted to continue to interrogate that question, and for the US to really think about who's participating and in which ways in order to represent the US in its fullness. And overall, people all agreed that the US participation in Expos really matters, that it's important that the US continue to be there, not only to share the US to the rest of the world, but also to have an opportunity for people from the US to engage with other global international citizens, a way for difference, as one person put it, to make difference less scary. And really be able to explore each other and different traditions through this opportunity. So here are some pictures of Expos in the United States, some of the ones that I interviewed individuals about. And this sort of gives you an idea of some of the different looks, some of the different footprints that were on the cities through the Expos. So people in the United States, or who went to Expos hosted in the United States, oftentimes remarked on the footprint of the Expos, that a lot of the things like the Seattle Space Needle it was built during an Expo and it became the symbol of the city. And so thinking about Expos as a way to invest in cities and to help cities grow or increase their infrastructure to really improve a lot of the city, but also they called for making sure that this development or investment is done mindfully, that there is not a continuation of urban renewal, of forced removal, as happened in San Antonio, but really making sure that everyone in the city can benefit from this, that it's really a common good that the Expo comes, that it doesn't just benefit a few people, it doesn't just benefit the tourist industry, but can really benefit everyone. They also thought about Expos as an exchange throughout their cities, not just located in the grounds of the Expo, but really it's about sharing food in restaurants throughout the city, about musicians interacting and sharing their approach to music throughout the city. So really seeing it as an opportunity to bring people to their cities and show what their cities had to the rest of the world, and open their cities up to the rest of the world. In addition to this, some people at Expos experience them as a way to rethink of their careers. Some people changed careers because of the expos, because they were experienced to different opportunities. One person was in school for fashion design, and she saw a lot of the patterns and the colors that she saw at the expos. She started incorporating them into her fashion design. Other people suddenly decided that they wanted to become international teachers and continue to engage in this way. Some people really resonated with the technology on display, and the expos created an opportunity for them to understand the culture of technology and technology communities, in addition to the science themselves, but really thinking about how there are different communities focused not just around traditions and cultures, but also around careers and career paths. And so thinking about it that way and being exposed to them at a young age really helped them find a place for themselves and encourage their own interests and their careers later in life. For youth ambassadors who traveled abroad, a lot of them use this as an opportunity to explore their own backgrounds. Some of them had family in different countries, and this was an opportunity for them to really get to spend some time in those countries and learn those cultures and traditions and explore their own multicultural backgrounds and identities. They also really enjoyed representing the US and challenging some of the stereotypes that Americans only speak English, or that there's a one certain type of American or one way to be American. And they exposed people from around the world to all the different ways that you can be an American, and the diversity that is captured in the United States. They also, again, really enjoyed speaking different languages and being able to engage with people through different languages and expel some of those notions that the world has to come to America by bringing America to the world. So these are just a few overviews of some of the things that we learned during our research and talking to people who experienced the expos. And I am more than happy to give some more examples and talk about more of these if anyone has questions during the Q&A. But now I'd like to turn it over to Cara to bring us up to the present and to the future of expos.
Great, thank you, Anna. That was really interesting, and it's been wonderful to get to know you through this project over the last couple months. And Lisa, thank you so much. That was actually, for me, having worked on expos over the last 8 years, really interesting to hear about kind of the early history. So thank you so much. And I'm excited to be here today and talk a little bit about the World Expo that recently wrapped up in Dubai, Expo 2020, and the US participation in that, along with where we're going next. So I will share my screen. Great. The World Expos today are managed by the US participation is managed by the US Department of State. And within the Department of State, there's an international expositions unit under which I work. Previously, I worked on the Milan Expo as well, on the Usa Pavilion at Milan Expo 2015. And had the pleasure of working with a new team starting up a few years ago to prepare for and ultimately participate in the Dubai Expo, which was slated to open in 2020, but because of COVID was postponed by 1 year. So the US Pavilion at Expo 2020 Dubai operated from October 1st, 2021 through March 31st, 2022. We welcomed 1.2 million visitors under the theme Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of the Future. Our 40,000 square foot pavilion featured 8 exhibits celebrating American innovation, ingenuity, history, and freedom. And we featured 4 American artifacts, including on loan from NASA, a moon rock and a piece of a Martian meteorite, and on loan from the Library of Congress, Thomas Jefferson's copy of the Quran, and on loan from Cornell University, a full-size replica of the Opportunity rover on Mars. We had a fantastic presentation in Dubai, and I was excited and pleased to travel to Dubai 4 times over the course of the 6-month Expo to open our pavilion, to close it, and participate in some other programs. The cornerstone of US pavilions and our participation in World's Fairs is not just the physical building and the exhibits, but the faces of America. And our Youth Ambassador Program and or Student Ambassador Program, as it was one time called, has been a cornerstone of our participation in World's Fairs, dating back to the 1950s. This year, 75 youth ambassadors ages 18 through 29 from 37 US states and the District of Columbia participated, acting as pavilion guides, acting and then performing a host of other duties throughout the pavilion, whether it was supporting a VIP visitor, supporting our media team, supporting our events team. These young people hailed from 79 colleges and universities and spoke 24 languages, which is critically important for us at Expos, for youth ambassadors to be able to communicate with visitors from across the globe in their native tongue and really reinforce and explain our exhibits and our messaging in the pavilion. And we were pleased to have one youth ambassador from the state of Oregon and others from the greater Pacific Northwest. Samara served as a youth ambassador, and I know the team was really pleased with her excitement, her ideas, and her enthusiasm to represent the state of Oregon and represent the United States in Dubai. We had another youth ambassador, Eugene from Boise State University, and you can see on the right is a meeting that was organized with Senator Merkley, and we're so pleased that these young folks served with us in Dubai and have come back to the United States or onward to other countries, having that great experience. And many youth ambassadors do choose to go on into the field of foreign relations and international affairs, some of which even end up joining the Foreign Service and joining me here at the State Department. It's a really great opportunity, and we are excited once again in the future to call on our friends from across the United States to help us recruit youth ambassadors as we look towards Osaka, Japan. We also showcase the best of American culture through a robust cultural performers program. Even given the challenges of COVID, we were able to bring together 189 performances and 39 speaking events at the USA Pavilion over the 6 months. We had 58,000 plus attendees at our events. And our cultural performers are affiliated with all 50 US states. And those events also included 4 culinary diplomacy events, 4 events with Disney, and a sports diplomacy event with the Harlem Globetrotters. And there were members from various music and dance groups from the Pacific Northwest and from Oregon, including groups like King Kazam, Pipeline Vocal, Penn Masala, and the Tulane University Marching Band. In addition to our cultural program, an important component is promoting American businesses. And American businesses were thrilled and excited to leverage the pavilion and our presence at Expo to build new relations in the Middle East region, to launch new businesses, new brands, new partnerships. We held 175 events at our pavilion. 7 American companies signed MOUs, and 6 US states brought trade delegations. Again, given the challenges of COVID, we were absolutely thrilled that so many people made the commitment to come to Dubai and were able to come and participate in the Expo. I'm going to try to show a quick video. This is a short video. It's less than 2 minutes. It's a farewell video we put together that sort of highlights our time in Dubai. So with that.
Hi, I'm Bob Clark. I'm here to welcome you to the US Pavilion. Come and see the American dream.
The USA Pavilion at Expo 2020 Dubai welcomed over 1.5 million visitors. For those 6 months, guests from around the world experienced our theme of life, liberty, and the pursuit of the future, which celebrated the American people, ideas, and contributions that have changed and improved lives in the United States and around the world. Expo 2020 Dubai was one of the largest events of its kind ever to be held in the Middle East. The USA Pavilion provided a unique platform to share American culture, promote mutual understanding, engage global audiences, and support international business opportunities.
The United States greatly appreciates the UAE's commitment to a successful, inclusive, safe, and healthy Expo for everyone.
The USA Pavilion at Expo 2020 allowed us to share our American history, to promote mutual understanding, and to highlight our commitment to a rules-based international system. Thank you for joining us on our World's Fair journey. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of the future.
So with that, we look ahead, and in rather exciting fashion, the United States is hoping to bring an Expo back home after 43 years. As previously talked about, the last Expo in the US was in 1984 in New Orleans. And President Biden last year recognized the state of Minnesota as the official US bid for Expo 2027. The state of Minnesota and the city of Minneapolis is hoping to win the rights to host an Expo in 2027 with the theme Healthy People, Healthy Planet, Health and Well-Being for All. This would be a 3-month-long specialized Expo, resulting in over 33,000 jobs created and over 2.6 billion in economic activity in the United States. And it would be the first World's Fair to showcase U.S. innovations in global health and sustainability. It's not just an opportunity for Minnesota, but is an opportunity for the United States as a whole to become a host again, to welcome foreign countries and foreign pavilions from across the world, and to welcome foreign visitors from across the world to the U.S. over a 3-month period. Specialized expos are slightly different than world expos. They're smaller in footprint and in length, only 3 months versus 6. And instead of countries building separate pavilions or separate buildings, each country is allotted a square footage amount of space inside a pre-existing built building. So more along the lines of a kind of a larger setup that you would see at a convention center, where a certain square footage of space, 5,000 to 8,000 square feet would be provided. And then each country would sort of build out that space. So we will know in June when the BIE meets, the Biennial International Expositions Organization will convene in Paris, and the members will vote on who has the right to host Expo 2027. And we will know at that time if we will indeed host a World's Fair once again. And the Department of State is supporting the bid by promoting Expo 2027 and all of the things the United States has to offer to the international community in terms of hosting an expo. So that is exciting news, and we'll know in about a year from now the outcome. And in the meantime, the United States and other countries are quickly gearing up for Expo 2025 Osaka, which will open on April 13th, 2025, under the theme Designing Future Society for Our Lives. It'll be the largest public and economic diplomacy event in the Indo-Pacific region since the Expo 2010 in Shanghai. And Japan is estimating over 28 million visitors to attend Osaka. And the Department of State is in the planning process right now so that we can once again successfully participate in Osaka by building a US pavilion in Japan for the 6-month-long World's Fair. That's the end of my presentation. So let me stop sharing and I can turn it over for questions.
Great. Thank you, all three of you. This is Tim DeRoche, the Director of Programs for World Oregon. So much to unpack with all of this. Before we jump in, because you sort of ended on this note, Cara, I'm wondering if you can answer a question from the audience on why you think there has not been a World's Fair in the US since 1984.
Sure. I think a number of factors, right? I mean, I think it's probably one of the same reasons why the United States hasn't hosted an Olympics in a long time, but will once again host the Olympics in Los Angeles in 2028. These sorts of mega events can be expensive to put on if you are building from scratch and not reusing existing infrastructure and reusing existing facilities and existing space. And I think also, unfortunately, right now there's legislation that bars the US federal government from the State Department from using its own funds, its own appropriated funds for participation in international expos, and also bars us from supporting domestic expos. So we are very hopeful that this limiting legislation may get overturned in the next year or so, or that Congress may act and put in place parameters that would allow us to use our own funding, both for international and domestic activities. But many other countries don't have these limitations in place, and their federal governments can and do robustly support mega events of this size and scale. I mean, and they use these types of mega events for lots of reasons, not just economic, but political. I mean, if you look at what happened in Beijing recently. So the United States, I think, looks at these world events in a much different lens. And it is really on the American cities and states that are interested in hosting. And there's much less involvement at the federal level in terms of financial support. We certainly are very supportive in terms of existing resources and in which ways we can be supportive. But I think in the end, in the United States, it does come down to money. But this time around with Minnesota, they've identified a plot of land that's adjacent to the Mall of America. And they have pre-built in a lot of infrastructure already. They have the hotels that they need, they have the restaurants, they've got the infrastructure already in place. They already have a light rail system to take visitors to the site. And they already welcome almost 1 million visitors a week to the Mall of America as it is. So I think now cities and states are going about this in a much smarter way by utilizing existing resources, tapping into land and space that's either already available and pre-built or is ready to receive. And also thinking a lot about the legacy as well. It's not just building for building's sake. I think in order to be successful, any city, especially a US city, needs to think about a legacy. And in the case of Minnesota, all of the buildings, many of the buildings that they're planning to erect, they have a legacy plan for in terms of onward use for businesses and other endeavors. So in the same way that LA 2028 is using existing resources, and what they do build will stay as legacy components. So that's a long answer, but lots
so in thinking about legacies, I mean, Lisa, you open up with such a rich and, in fact, very, very troubling vision of our past. And we've been seeing this over the last few years. I'm always reminded of the quote from Steinbeck. I think I'm paraphrasing it, but how do we know it is us without our past? But teaching about our past has become very challenging with anti-critical race theory pushback, people trying to divert history out of classrooms. So it's getting harder to have some of these discussions. And do you see the ability to really, peel back the onion skin on the controversies around race and the legacies of colonialism becoming easier or harder as we go forward?
Do you mean specifically at World's Fairs and Expos?
Well, I would say this is one tiny thing. If we want to, put pins on a map of knowledge, this is one thing that seems to challenge a lot of this. I mean, the other one is issues around Indigenous education. I mean, what do you think it will take for us to be comfortable talking about the uncomfortableness of our past?
Well, I think it would take a real commitment to inclusion, not just. Well, I think it's quite important to allow people to talk about their own experiences and to represent themselves and to have the freedom to choose the way in which they will represent themselves, right? So it can't be kind of overly choreographed or controlled by those who might have their primary concern be one of entertainment or commercial success, right? So if that commitment is really strong, right, of inclusion and on everyone's terms, right? If there are open conversations about the parameters of self-representation, and so that really troubling power dynamic is removed, right, between kind of the visitor and a presenter, where people can actually present themselves the way they want to be presented, right? Then that might be a way to kind of break through some of the tension around this, right? If people can actually talk about how they live with the legacies of slavery and can talk about, generations of being American, but being an African American or Asian American, right? Like what that means. I think it would be fully possible at World's Fairs, right? It could be a really enriching experience. And it just takes a commitment to inclusion in those conversations.
Anna, did you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just add that a lot of the people we talked to were calling for this and asking for this, that you have to keep in mind that we were interviewing people about World's Fairs hosted in the US in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which is a very different context than today's America. But they were people were still asking for Expos to be a place where people from around the globe could come together and talk about some of these issues, of talking about social justice, racial justice, poverty, houselessness in all of their different countries, and ways that people are trying to confront these issues, different solutions different communities and countries have found, so that we could talk about this not as just something isolated, and that's not to absolve the US for what it has done, but thinking about how these are issues that are similar throughout a lot of the world, and that a lot of countries and communities are trying to tackle these. And Expos are an opportunity to bring people together and have these discussions, as well as thinking about the way that Expos present and talk about the US, and making sure that it's an opportunity, as Lisa said, for people to present themselves the way that they want to be presented, rather than being told they have to do a certain thing or represent a certain thing, but really having it be a place where we talk about the US in its fullness. And that is both the things that we want to celebrate, but the things that we're working on and the things that we find challenging, so that we can have these really honest conversations. And that's what a lot of the people who we interviewed were asking for this opportunity to have these robust conversations and talk about really hard things, and not just present an idealized picture of what we would like the US to be, but maybe it isn't yet.
You know, it was such an extraordinary trajectory of time within the oral histories. I mean, when you think of how the world, how the US has changed from the 60s and 70s and the 80s, I'm curious, as you were shaping this oral history narrative, how the extent to which fairs play an active role in our strategic foreign policy and US interests abroad, how did that come into into the discussion or into the narrative?
That's a great question. That was, that was something that some people really were tuned into, and thinking about, really being aware of certain countries that participated, and what was happening during those times in those countries. But kind of one of the ironies that I found was, I would ask people about how they thought the Cold War shaped the Expos that were hosted in their cities. And they had to think about it for a while, and they thought it didn't really affect the Expos, and they didn't really see that as affecting the Expos, or that some of them couldn't remember whether or not Russia participated in the Expo in the US, or China participated in the Expo in the US. So for me, it was really interesting to see this, the Expo, which I understand, especially during that time, to be very much in the mix with Cold War and international diplomacy. And yet people who visited the World's Fairs didn't see it that way and didn't experience it that way, which I don't really know what to make of that, but I found that really, really interesting.
Well, and so here's something for all three of you to consider. When I think about the history of World's Fairs, I mean, so much of it is about invention, it's about innovation, it's about hope. And I think back to, Henry Adams writing about the Virgin and the Dynamo and the dawn of the machine age, fairs that looked at speed and travel, at space exploration, these things that were really defining globally where we're going. And when I think about what is one of the single things that is really defining us, aside from a global pandemic right now, is the question of climate. And I'm wondering if you that going forward with the Expo, that climate could be a driving theme or a unifier around solutions that benefit all of us in the future.
I'll just quickly start off with this. I think absolutely, thinking about New Orleans in particular, and that Expo's theme was all about the river, And for some people, because the Expo renovated part of the riverfront and made it more accessible and not just a place where ships landed and goods were taken off or put on ships, that people were actually able to go to the riverfront. And so for some people, it really gave them a relationship to this river that cuts through their city and changed the way that they thought about the environment and the impacts. And we all know that for New Orleans, water in the river is very important with flooding and hurricanes, but it gave them a more complex understanding of the environment and their city. So I think that there are many opportunities to continue that and to talk about especially the footprint of the Expo and how Expos are being thought about more sustainably. And as Cara mentioned, thinking about the legacy of the Expos in these cities, and climate change is definitely a part of that as well.
Cara, are there thoughts, or do you hear these conversations in the development? I'm thinking about the Expo unit. I'm imagining this incredible brain trust of people sitting around the State Department. It's like this hive of thinking around this. How is climate entering into the discussions?
It definitely is entering into the discussions, and even in Dubai, sustainability was one of the three focuses. And many of the pavilions in Dubai had, the primary focus of their pavilion, of their building, of their exhibition was sustainability, looking at it from, a host of different factors. Being in the Middle East, I think there was a lot of very innovative approaches to air conditioning. And, some were really successful in harnessing various technologies to pull, water from the air, which there's not a lot of in the desert, and looking at, a host of other factors. Many pavilions made the choice not to fully air condition their buildings, given A, the costs, and B, trying to have as light of a carbon footprint as possible. And there were a few pavilions that just made a conscious choice to have a zero carbon footprint. So it was definitely a focus for sure, not just in the buildings and the energy, but in thinking about the legacy piece. And the Dutch pavilion in particular thought about how they would reuse and recycle almost every component of that building, which was really interesting. The U.S. pavilion, as I mentioned, we have funding challenges in terms of our congressional legislation. And so we had a rather late start in Dubai, and did not have the time or ability to be able to put together a construction plan and an engineering plan that would allow us to think outside the box and to focus on sustainability. At the end of the day, we were one of the last countries to break ground, and we just wanted to open on time, unfortunately. In Osaka, as we move forward and as we have the bandwidth and the runway to be able to plan accordingly, we are very focused on the sustainability factor, and are seeking guidance from organizations like the U.S. Green Building Council and others to identify American businesses and companies that have innovative building products and building supply products that we might work with to have a much lighter carbon footprint this time around in Osaka. But we're still working through our planning, and I think it's our extreme hope and desire to focus both physically on the sustainability piece with the building itself, but then also think about sort of our programming and other participant factors, and look at it through a lens that is more responsible.
In thinking about so-called civilization and progress, which were huge themes, I think, as Lisa pointed out early in the World's Fairs, doesn't climate seem like something that should be situated in that discussion, because without it and without confronting it, we have neither civilization or progress. I just kind of wanted to sneak that in there. I got a couple quick questions. One is, we're in an incredibly shrinking world of borders and interconnectedness, where all of a sudden national and cultural identities are not nearly as black and white, as it were, as they once were. Yet we're also inexplicably polarized on many levels. So can expos make a difference? And are they still worth the investment, especially when we are challenged by things like public health and food insecurity and global conflict?
So I would say this, and the most recent expo in Dubai, I think, is a good example. By bringing so many countries together in one small space, by allowing these countries to explore and promote their own, innovations, their own technologies, their own ideas, that's how we collectively, sort of as a planet, are able to learn from each other. And for a good example, I think of the Italian Pavilion had so many interesting, innovative companies, Italian companies. Every time you sort of walked through, you would think to yourself, wow, is that something that, I could put something like that in my house, or I could put something like that in my garden. And, I think it gave the average person even a greater appreciation and understanding for small things that you can do in your own life to decrease your carbon footprint. And certainly, it's a big opportunity for those in the building, in the commercial, building space globally, to come together and not only sort of marvel at what is sort of architectural innovation in the design and build from an architectural sense, but also, it's about promoting all of these different, companies and brands and technologies and innovative approaches to sustainability. So from that standpoint, I think the more that we can bring countries together in a smaller space, in even a small conversation or even a big conversation, the greater impact and outcomes we can see. And I know many of the smaller nations, came away from their participation in Dubai, really taking back home a lot of best practices and approaches to policy, and a host of other factors. So it might, I believe it's even more impactful for smaller nations who really don't have a lot of resources, but can access and tap into the resources of 100 plus countries, in one place.
Great. How about Lisa or Anna?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I've been thinking about how so many World's Fairs are kind of, they have been premised on kind of unity and consensus, but what if, the future of World's Fairs actually kind of acknowledge the polarized moment that we live in and think of these fairs as opportunities to think about how we solve big problems. And part of the point there is acknowledging that we have big problems, right? That there's not agreement, but there's also ways in which models of conversation or models of kind of reaching across metaphorical aisles, right, have produced changes for people. So I think kind of like focusing on people, perhaps less on celebrations of technology and innovation, or thinking of innovation in terms of like how to address social problems, might make World's Fairs especially important going forward.
And I would just echo that with, for most of the people we talked to, it was that person-to-person interaction that they found so powerful, and that for many people it was eye-opening, so that as they went traveling later in life, they were less afraid to talk to people who were different from them. And so, as Lisa said, it was this experience of sort of modeling, how do you have these conversations? How do you interact with people? How do you not be afraid about asking someone about their traditions or cultures or the way that they think about something, that really for some people came out of their experiences at Expos, and is the value of Expos moving forward. Some people also remembered, particularly in New York City, seeing demonstrations of nuclear energy and the way that they showed how nuclear energy can be safe, that it's not, if done correctly, it's not necessarily a big major pollutant or something to be afraid of. And so I think Expos are also an opportunity to display some of this technological innovation that can help dispel some of the fears or hesitations around adopting some of those innovations. That is something that people remembered from the 60s and could be something beneficial moving forward.
So World Oregon is, we're part of a network of the World Affairs Councils of America, and we're really, in many ways, founded from the better nature of thinking about this idea of soft power, which is not everything is waged through building and warfare, but through discussion and connection and people-to-people connection, as you're talking about. I often make jokes that these days it is not about geography, it's about the weography. I'm wondering, just as a closer, I'm wondering what you think. The US has certainly received a lot of criticism in recent years in terms of racial and economic disparity. Do you think that the world still sees the quote, values innovation and its people as America's great soft power assets? Don't all jump at once.
Okay, I'll go first. I think there's two sides to this. Unfortunately, with sort of the predominance of disinformation online over the last probably 5 to 7 years, there's less trust, and there's an unfortunate sort of dark side of not just in the United States but globally for people to believe and spread disinformation when it comes to the United States. We see this all over the world, but especially in places like China and Russia. And so there is much less trust of the United States, by sort of global citizens for a variety of reasons, but certainly disinfo feeds into that mistrust. And so, perhaps when it comes to Expos, seeing is believing. And so while a lot of people have misperceptions about what the United States is today, what the United States government is, or what they believe it to be, Expos are an opportunity, a physical opportunity. And, you can read a lot online, but, if you come to the US Pavilion, you meet a youth ambassador who is an American, but speaks your same language and maybe perhaps even looks similar to you. And you see and hear for yourself, a tiny piece of what America really is. Perhaps that's, enough to, make one question, do I believe everything I read online? So I think that being said, America still has, thankfully, a reputation of being a leader in the advancement of science and technology, of innovation, and a pillar of democracy. We're not perfect. As the president says, we're striving, to be that more perfect union. I think we recognize our imperfections as a nation. But the World's Fairs are an important way to bring people together in real life, in a real way, to exchange ideas. And like I said, I always say when it comes to Expos, you have to see to believe. And there's no greater power than, physically being in a space and meeting someone. So I'll leave it at that.
I think this is such an important question, and it's so layered. Most of the people who we talked to identified these as the core values or things that they thought were important for the U.S. to show at Expos. The question of whether or not that is reflected in U.S. policies, that's a huge question, and that's definitely worth talking about. I think I will give a couple examples to show the ways in which Expos can address this or start these conversations. And they come from San Antonio, where there were a lot of experiences of inequity. There was forced removal of a neighborhood in order to make space for the Expo. And that's something that the city is still working on addressing. And they are talking about it. And at the same time, one of the people I spoke to talked about how her family had been there for generations, had lived there when Texas was trying to be its own, or Teja was trying to be its own area, its own country, when it was controlled by Mexico. And then, of course, when it became part of the United States. And she talked about growing up in this place where she was, her name was anglicized in school, and she was told not to speak Spanish, and felt like she was being forced to conform to this ideal of the Anglo-American. And then with the Expo, she was hired because she was fluent in Spanish. And she found that this was one place where her identity, not just as an American, but her full identity, was valued and celebrated over people who only spoke English, and over that very sort of picture perfect Anglo-American ideal that she had been sort of pitted against when she was younger. That this was an opportunity where she really saw, in this one particular instance, that the US through the Expo was really valuing her full identity and celebrating her full identity. So I think that the Expos have potential. It, of course, depends on how they are used and how aware of the power dynamics and how much the power dynamics are being addressed in a particular Expo. But I think there are these opportunities to really put on display how much we are investing as a country in these core values and ideals that we want to uphold and want to celebrate.
Great. Lisa, any final thoughts?
I'll just tell Cara I went to Milan 2015 to the American Pavilion, and I have my critical American history lens on, and I loved it. I was like so proud to be an American. So yeah, like it's really possible to tell a lot of to tell important stories and tell experiences, to show that America is not one thing, right? But the value of diversity makes it stronger, and it is something that we can be proud of.
Well, there is no better way I can think to end the program, so I'm going to bring Derek Olson back on. Derek, you're it. I want to thank all three of our speakers for being with us today. And Derek, take us into the day. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tim, and Lisa, Anna, and Cara. Thank you for that excellent discussion. Audience, for the great questions. As noted, this program is recorded. It will be posted later on YouTube and be able to be shared not only through us, but through the Global Ties US network, of which we are a proud member, that partners with the U.S. Department of State, specifically the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, who helped make this program possible, in part also through the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the Department of State and Global Ties US. Thanks again to our partners at the Oregon Historical Society for also promoting this and bringing in especially the shared look at Oregon's history. And we thank you and look forward to seeing you at future events. Again, thanks speakers and audience. Everyone stay healthy and safe, and we'll look forward to you at our next event.